In the unforgiving wilderness of California's Sierra Nevada mountains, experienced climber and geologist Julian Carter vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine day hike. His abandoned truck at Whitney Portal sparked a massive search operation that would consume hundreds of volunteers and thousands of dollars, yet yield no clues. But when the search ended, investigators made a discovery so shocking it defied every assumption about what had happened in those granite peaks. This is the story of a mystery that challenged everything rescue teams thought they knew about missing persons in the wilderness. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The morning mist clung to the granite peaks of the Sierra Nevada like ghostly fingers, reluctant to surrender to the growing warmth of the September sun. In the small mountain town of Lone Pine, California, Julian Carter's alarm clock pierced the pre-dawn silence at exactly 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 15 years of his climbing career. The sound echoed through his modest cabin, a weathered structure that sat perched on the edge of town like a sentinel watching over the valley below. Julian's calloused hand reached across the nightstand with practiced precision, silencing the alarm before it could disturb the sacred quiet that mountain dwellers cherished. His movements were deliberate and economical, each gesture honed by years of climbing where efficiency could mean the difference between life and death. The floorboards beneath his feet creaked a familiar greeting as he rose, their aged wood bearing witness to countless early morning preparations for adventures in the high country. At 34 years old, Julian Carter had earned a reputation that preceded him throughout the climbing community of California and beyond. His name was whispered with reverence in gear shops from Bishop to Mammoth Lakes, spoken with admiration around campfires in the eastern Sierra, and mentioned with awe in academic circles where geology and mountaineering intersected. He possessed that rare combination of intellectual rigor and physical prowess that made him equally comfortable presenting research findings at Stanford University or navigating a treacherous icefall at 14,000 feet. The walls of his cabin bore testament to his achievements. Framed photographs captured moments of triumph on peaks across 3 continents, their surfaces reflecting the soft amber light of his bedside lamp. There was Julian on the summit of Mount Whitney, arms raised in victory against a backdrop of endless blue sky. Another showed him rappelling into a deep crevasse in Alaska, his headlamp cutting through the ethereal ice formations like a sword through crystal. Maps covered nearly every available wall space, their surfaces marked with red ink trails documenting routes conquered and annotated with his characteristic precise handwriting, noting geological formations, weather patterns, and safety observations. His morning routine was a meditation in preparation. Julian moved through his cabin with the fluid grace of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times before. He ground coffee beans imported from a small roastery in Mammoth, the rich aroma filling the space and mixing with the scent of pine that permanently permeated the wooden walls. While the coffee brewed, he checked his weather apps with the scrutiny of a surgeon reviewing X-rays. Wind speeds, temperature fluctuations, precipitation probabilities, and atmospheric pressure readings were all noted and cross-referenced with his extensive mental database of Sierra Nevada weather patterns. The meteorological data for September 15th looked promising. Clear skies were forecast with temperatures ranging from 38 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn to a comfortable 65 by afternoon. Wind speeds would remain below 15 miles per hour, well within acceptable parameters for the route he had planned. Julian nodded with satisfaction as he sipped his coffee, the ceramic mug warming his palms while steam rose between his weathered fingers like incense in a mountain temple. His preparation extended far beyond checking the weather. Julian pulled his well-worn gear list from a manila folder, its pages soft from countless handlings and marked with updates in different colored inks representing years of refinement. Each item was checked off mentally as he gathered his equipment. Climbing harness, adjusted to his exact measurements and bearing the scuff marks of countless ascents. Helmet, its white surface scratched but integrity intact. The headlamp attachment tested and retested. Ropes, inspected strand by strand for any signs of wear or damage. Their kernmantle construction still robust after years of faithful service. The ritual of packing his backpack was almost ceremonial. Julian arranged items with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for a critical endgame. Heavier items like his water bottles and first aid kit went closest to his back for optimal weight distribution. Frequently needed items like snacks, sunscreen, and his geological hammer occupied easily accessible pockets. Emergency gear, including his whistle, emergency blanket, and backup headlamp, were distributed strategically throughout the pack to ensure redundancy in case of compartment failure. His geological equipment received special attention. Julian's reputation in academic circles stemmed from his unique ability to combine extreme alpinism with rigorous field research. His backpack contained a portable spectrometer for mineral analysis, rock sampling tools crafted from the finest steel, and a weather-proof notebook filled with blank pages awaiting new discoveries. Each instrument was secured with military-grade carabiners and housed in protective cases that could withstand impacts that would destroy conventional equipment. As dawn broke across the Sierra Nevada, painting the granite peaks in shades of gold and salmon pink, Julian performed his final equipment check. His fingers traced the familiar contours of each carabiner, testing gates and ensuring smooth operation. He inspected his approach shoes, their aggressive tread patterns designed to provide traction on loose scree and polished granite. The soles showed wear consistent with thousands of miles of mountain approaches, but their structural integrity remained sound. Julian's reputation for safety was legendary among his peers. In 15 years of serious climbing, he had never required rescue, never been involved in an accident that resulted in injury, and never failed to return from a planned expedition. His preparation was exhaustive, his decision-making conservative, and his knowledge of the Sierra Nevada encyclopedic. Fellow climbers often joked that Julian knew every loose rock between Mount Whitney and Half Dome, every weather microclimate from Yosemite to the John Muir Wilderness. The drive from his cabin to the Whitney Portal trailhead took 47 minutes along winding mountain roads that Julian knew by heart. His truck, a reliable Toyota Tacoma with over 200,000 miles on the odometer, navigated the serpentine asphalt with mechanical precision. The vehicle bore the patina of countless mountain adventures, its paint dulled by high-altitude sun, and its bumpers bearing the scars of encounters with granite and ice. Yet like its owner, the truck's appearance belied its reliability and capability. Julian arrived at the Whitney Portal parking area as the first rays of sunlight began illuminating the massive granite walls that towered above the trailhead. The parking area, carved from the mountainside at an elevation of 8,600 feet, offered a spectacular view of the Alabama hills, stretching eastward toward the desert. At this early hour, only a handful of other vehicles occupied the lot, their owners likely beginning their own dawn patrol adventures in the high country. He parked in his customary spot, a space near the trailhead information kiosk where he could easily review the latest conditions and regulations. Julian's preparation continued even here, as he consulted the trail register and weather postings one final time. Recent entries from other climbers provided valuable real-time intelligence about route conditions, wildlife activity, and potential hazards. He noted that snow lingered above 12,000 feet from an unseasonable storm the previous week, information that would influence his route selection and gear choices. The transformation from Julian Carter the person to Julian Carter the mountain athlete was subtle, but profound. As he shouldered his pack and adjusted the straps with practiced efficiency, his demeanor shifted into the focused intensity that had carried him safely through countless challenging situations. His breathing deepened and slowed, his movements became more deliberate, and his awareness expanded to encompass the subtle environmental cues that experienced mountaineers read like text on a page. Julian set off up the trail as the sun crested the granite ridges above, his footsteps joining the rhythm of countless other adventurers who had walked this path before him. The trail wound upward through stunted whitebark pines and across granite slabs polished smooth by centuries of weather and foot traffic. His pace was measured and sustainable, a rhythm developed over years of experience that allowed him to cover vast distances without excessive fatigue. Hours passed in the mountains without Julian's return. The sun that had welcomed him at dawn now blazed overhead, its rays reflecting off granite walls and heating the thin air to uncomfortable levels. In town, Laura Kincaid, Julian's older sister, began experiencing the first stirrings of concern that would soon blossom into full-blown anxiety. Laura sat in her laboratory at the Sierra Nevada Research Institute, surrounded by microscopes and specimen jars, but her attention kept drifting to the large clock mounted on the far wall. Julian had promised to call her by 2 p.m. to confirm his safe return from what was supposed to be a routine day hike. As a field biologist specializing in high-altitude ecosystems, Laura understood the demands and timelines of mountain research better than most family members of climbers. She knew Julian's habits, his conservative approach to risk management, and his unwavering commitment to communication protocols. The clock struck 3 p.m. without any word from her brother. Laura's scientific mind attempted to rationalize the delay. Perhaps Julian had discovered an interesting geological formation that merited extended study. Maybe he had encountered other climbers in need of assistance and had stopped to help, as was his nature. Cell phone coverage in the High Sierra was notoriously unreliable, making communication delays common and usually innocent. By 4 p.m., Laura's concern had evolved beyond rationalization. She began making calls to Julian's usual climbing partners, hoping one of them might have knowledge of his plans or current location. Each conversation yielded the same response. Julian had mentioned a solo research hike, but had not shared specific details about his intended route or timeline. This lack of specificity was unusual for Julian, whose planning was typically meticulous and well documented. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Sierra Nevada, Laura's scientific training warred with her sisterly intuition. Years of field research had taught her the value of systematic observation and logical deduction, but her growing anxiety was decidedly unscientific. She found herself staring at her phone, willing it to ring with Julian's familiar voice, explaining his delay with characteristic calm and detailed analysis. The call never came. By evening, Laura's concern had crystallized into action. She drove the familiar route from her laboratory to the Whitney portal, her hands gripping the steering wheel with increasing tension as each mile passed without resolution. The parking area that had been nearly empty at dawn now hosted the vehicles of returning hikers, their occupants sharing stories of successful adventures and planning future expeditions. Julian's Toyota Tacoma sat exactly where he had parked it 12 hours earlier. The truck looked abandoned in the gathering dusk, its windshield reflecting the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above. Laura parked beside her brother's vehicle and approached it with the methodical caution of a scientist examining an unexpected phenomenon. She peered through the windows, noting Julian's everyday jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat and his spare water bottles still secured in their holders. The sight of Julian's truck, sitting alone and unattended as darkness fell across the Sierra Nevada, transformed Laura's concern into something approaching panic. In 15 years of serious climbing, Julian had never failed to return as scheduled. His reputation for punctuality and communication was as solid as the granite peaks he loved to climb. The empty truck represented a deviation from established patterns that Laura's analytical mind could not readily explain or dismiss. Standing in the parking lot as the temperature dropped and the first hints of frost began forming on the windshields of nearby vehicles, Laura experienced the terrible moment when worry becomes fear, when concern transforms into the acknowledgement that something was genuinely wrong. The mountains that had been Julian's playground and laboratory for so many years suddenly seemed vast and threatening. Their granite faces transformed from familiar friends into potential adversaries, hiding unknowable secrets. The discovery of Julian's truck at Whitney Portal marked the end of hope that his absence was merely a communication oversight or minor delay. As Laura stood in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the whispered conversations of other climbers discussing their day's adventures, she realized that her brother's routine mountain research expedition had become something else entirely. The transformation from a scheduled day hike into a missing person case was complete, and the machinery of search and rescue was about to be set into motion across the unforgiving wilderness of the Sierra Nevada. The emergency operations center that materialized in the Whitney Portal parking lot within hours of Julian's disappearance bore little resemblance to the peaceful mountain trailhead it had been just 24 hours earlier. Banks of portable floodlights cast harsh white illumination across the asphalt, transforming the familiar wilderness access point into something resembling a military staging area. The gentle sounds of wind through pine needles and distant water cascading down granite faces were overwhelmed by the constant chatter of radio communications, the rumble of diesel generators, and the purposeful movements of search and rescue personnel establishing their base of operations. Command vehicles arrived in a steady stream throughout the early morning hours, their emergency lights painting the surrounding granite walls in alternating patterns of red and blue. The Inyo County Sheriff's Office deployed their specialized mountain rescue unit, a team of highly trained volunteers who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of emergency in the treacherous terrain of the eastern Sierra. Their equipment filled multiple vehicles: technical rescue gear, medical supplies, communication equipment, and specialized tools designed for operations in environments where a single mistake could transform rescuers into additional victims requiring rescue themselves. Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of mountain rescues who had participated in over 300 search operations, established the incident command structure with military precision. His weathered face bore the deep tan and squint lines of someone who had spent decades working in high-altitude environments, and his movements carried the confident efficiency of a professional who understood that lives often depended on proper organization and clear communication. Rodriguez unfolded topographic maps across the hood of his vehicle, the paper crinkling in the mountain breeze as he began marking search sectors with colored pencils. The initial search plan divided the vast wilderness area surrounding Whitney Portal into manageable sectors, each assigned to teams with specific expertise and equipment. The most likely scenarios were analyzed and prioritized. Julian might have suffered an injury on an established trail, requiring evacuation teams with medical training and helicopter support. He could have become disoriented in deteriorating weather conditions, necessitating teams capable of tracking and survival assessment. Less likely but still possible was equipment failure that had stranded him in technical terrain, requiring rescue specialists with advanced climbing and rigging capabilities. Within 6 hours of the official search declaration, over 40 volunteers had assembled at the staging area. The response demonstrated the tight-knit nature of the Sierra Nevada climbing and hiking community, where news of a missing person traveled faster than wildfire through informal networks of outdoor enthusiasts. Experienced mountaineers arrived with their personal climbing equipment, ready to access terrain that would challenge even professional rescue teams. Local hiking clubs organized supply chains and communication networks. Rock climbing guides from the Alabama hills postponed commercial trips to contribute their specialized knowledge of the region's complex geography. The volunteer coordinator, Sarah Chen, a former Navy search and rescue swimmer who had relocated to the Sierra after her military service, established check-in procedures that would account for every person entering the wilderness during search operations. Her organizational skills transformed what could have been chaos into a coordinated effort, where each volunteer's capabilities were matched to appropriate assignments. Experienced climbers were assigned to technical terrain requiring advanced skills. Strong hikers familiar with the area took responsibility for established trail systems. Volunteers with medical training were distributed among teams to provide immediate care if Julian was found injured. The first teams departed the staging area as dawn painted the granite peaks in shades of rose and gold, their headlamps creating moving constellations as they dispersed along various approach routes. Each team carried standardized equipment loads including emergency medical supplies, technical rescue gear, extra food and water for a potential victim, and communication devices that would maintain contact with the command center. Team leaders conducted final equipment checks in the harsh glare of the floodlights, their voices calm and professional despite the urgency driving their preparations. The search pattern expanded systematically as teams covered increasingly remote terrain. Established trails received immediate attention, with searchers examining every switchback and rest area where Julian might have stopped or encountered difficulties. Off-trail routes that Julian was known to favor were analyzed using his previous trip reports and route descriptions found in his cabin. Rock climbing areas where he had conducted geological research were accessed by technical teams capable of rappelling into canyons and ascending vertical walls to investigate ledges and caves that ground-based searchers could not reach. Radio communications filled the airwaves with status reports and negative findings. Team Alpha reported clear trails with no signs of recent passage in the upper Whitney Creek drainage. Bravo team found fresh footprints near Consultation Lake, but determined they belonged to other hikers who had been contacted and cleared. Charlie team accessed technical climbing routes on the east face, but discovered no equipment, clothing, or other indicators of Julian's presence. Each negative report was logged and analyzed, gradually eliminating possibilities while expanding the geographic scope of areas requiring investigation. The California Highway Patrol contributed aerial support in the form of a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment and high-resolution cameras capable of detecting human-sized objects from significant altitudes. The aircraft methodically flew search patterns over the most likely areas, its crews scanning endless expanses of granite, pine forest, and alpine meadow for any sign of a missing climber. The thermal imaging revealed wildlife, other hikers, and numerous false positives that required ground team investigation, but no trace of Julian Carter. As the first day of searching drew to a close without producing any leads, The initial optimism that characterized the operation began transforming into something more complex and troubling. Experienced rescue personnel understood that statistics heavily favored finding missing persons within the first 24 hours, particularly in cases involving individuals with Julian's level of experience and preparation. His failure to appear at any of the obvious locations where an injured or stranded climber might be expected raised questions that went beyond simple accident scenarios. The evening debrief revealed the scope of terrain that had been covered during the day-long operation. Over 15 square miles of wilderness had been systematically searched by teams totaling nearly 60 personnel. Every established trail within Julian's documented hiking range had been traversed at least once. Technical climbing routes had been accessed and investigated. Popular camping areas had been checked for signs of overnight stays. The thoroughness of the search effort was impressive by any standard, making the absence of any clues even more perplexing. Search operations resumed at first light of the second day with expanded resources and refined strategies based on the previous day's findings. Additional volunteer teams arrived from climbing communities throughout California, their members having driven through the night to contribute their skills to the operation. Mountain rescue units from neighboring counties provided mutual aid, bringing specialized equipment and fresh personnel to supplement the increasingly exhausted local teams. The second day's search plan incorporated lessons learned from the initial effort, while expanding into more remote and technically challenging terrain. Teams were deployed to areas that would require Julian to have deviated significantly from his normal route selection criteria, acknowledging the possibility that his disappearance might involve circumstances beyond a simple hiking accident. Advanced climbing teams accessed previously unexplored areas of the high country, where rescue operations were complicated by altitude, exposure, and technical difficulty. Weather conditions during the second day deteriorated as predicted by meteorological forecasts, adding complexity and urgency to search operations. Afternoon thunderstorms, typical of September weather patterns in the Sierra Nevada, brought lightning, high winds, and localized precipitation that reduced visibility and created hazardous conditions for both searchers and any potential victim. Search teams were temporarily recalled from exposed positions during the worst weather. Valuable time lost as they sought shelter and waited for conditions to improve. The psychological toll of unsuccessful search efforts became evident among rescue personnel and volunteers as the second day progressed without significant findings. Experienced team leaders recognized the signs of frustration and fatigue that could compromise safety and decision-making effectiveness. Rest rotations were implemented to ensure that searchers remained alert and capable. Counseling resources were made available for volunteers struggling with the emotional stress of searching for a missing community member. Laura Kincaid established a presence at the command post that reflected her desperate need to contribute meaningfully to her brother's rescue while struggling with feelings of helplessness that threatened to overwhelm her scientific rationality. She provided invaluable intelligence about Julian's habits, preferences, and psychological profile that helped search coordinators refine their strategies. Her biological expertise proved useful in analyzing environmental conditions and wildlife behavior that might provide clues about human activity in the search area. The third day of search operations marked a critical transition in both strategy and expectations. Statistical analysis of similar cases suggested that survival prospects decreased dramatically after 72 hours, particularly in terrain as challenging as the high Sierra Nevada. Search coordinators were forced to balance the reality of diminishing survivor chances against the continued commitment of resources and personnel to an operation that was showing no signs of producing results. Advanced technical teams were deployed to increasingly remote and dangerous locations that would represent significant deviations from Julian's established patterns of route selection and risk management. These areas required helicopter insertion due to their remoteness and the time constraints imposed by deteriorating weather forecasts. Search teams rappelled into deep canyons, explored abandoned mine shafts, and investigated geological formations that might have attracted Julian's scientific interest, but would have required him to venture far beyond his documented plans. The mystery deepened when detailed analysis of Julian's equipment and personal effects revealed a troubling anomaly that had initially been overlooked in the urgency of launching search operations. Julian's emergency kit, a carefully assembled collection of survival gear that he carried on every mountain expedition without exception, was discovered in his truck rather than with him on the trail. The kit contained items that Julian considered absolutely essential for safe travel in the Sierra Nevada: emergency shelter, signaling devices, water purification tablets, high-energy food rations, and medical supplies. The discovery of the emergency kit in Julian's vehicle represented a fundamental departure from his established safety protocols that experienced members of the search team found impossible to reconcile with their knowledge of his character and methods. Julian's reputation for preparation and risk management was so well established that many searchers initially refused to believe he would have ventured into the mountains without his emergency equipment. The implications were disturbing and suggested that Julian's disappearance might involve factors beyond a simple hiking accident. Equipment specialists examined Julian's emergency kit with forensic attention to detail, hoping to find clues about his mental state or intentions on the day of his disappearance. Every item was catalogued and analyzed for signs of recent use or modification. The kit appeared complete and properly maintained, with no indication that Julian had intentionally removed items for use elsewhere, or had been in the process of reorganizing his equipment. The gear showed the careful maintenance characteristic of someone who understood that his life might depend on its functionality. The psychological profile that emerged from analysis of Julian's decision to leave his emergency equipment behind was deeply troubling to search coordinators and family members alike. Julian Carter was not an impulsive person prone to poor decision-making or casual attitude toward safety. His academic training, climbing experience, and professional responsibilities had reinforced conservative approaches to risk management throughout his adult life. The idea that he would deliberately venture into challenging terrain without proper emergency equipment contradicted everything known about his character and methods. Alternative explanations for the missing emergency kit were explored and analyzed, none of them providing satisfactory answers to the growing list of questions surrounding Julian's disappearance. Perhaps he had been distracted or rushed during his preparation and had simply forgotten the kit, although this seemed inconsistent with his methodical approach to equipment management. Maybe he had planned a shorter, less challenging hike than usual, and had determined that emergency gear was unnecessary. But this explanation was contradicted by the remote location where his truck was found, and the absence of any documentation describing reduced objectives. The fourth day of search operations brought expanded resources including additional helicopter support, specialized tracking dogs, and technical rescue experts from military special operations units who volunteered their services during off-duty time. The dogs, German shepherds trained specifically for wilderness search and rescue operations, were deployed along trails and in areas where human scent might have been preserved, despite several days of weather exposure. Their handlers worked the animals systematically through likely travel corridors, hoping to detect trace evidence of Julian's passage that human searchers might have missed. Helicopter operations expanded to include more remote areas of the Sierra Nevada where ground-based search teams would require days to reach and investigate thoroughly. Advanced imaging equipment capable of penetrating forest canopy and detecting objects concealed by vegetation was employed to search areas that visual observation from aircraft might miss. The technological resources devoted to finding Julian Carter represented one of the most comprehensive search efforts in the recent history of California mountain rescue operations. The dogs provided the first significant lead when one animal showed intense interest in an area several miles from any established trail, deep in a canyon system that would have required technical climbing skills to access safely. The dog's behavior suggested human scent, but ground teams investigating the location found no physical evidence of Julian's presence. The contradictory signals frustrated handlers and search coordinators, adding another puzzling element to a case that seemed to defy logical explanation. As the search entered its fifth day, the emotional toll on Julian's family became increasingly evident, despite Laura's efforts to maintain composure and contribute constructively to the operation. She spent long hours at the command post, analyzing topographic maps and providing input on areas where Julian might have gone, based on his geological interests and previous research activities. Her scientific background proved valuable in understanding the technical aspects of search strategy, but her personal investment in the outcome made it impossible for her to maintain the emotional detachment that typically characterized her professional work. Laura's conversations with search coordinators revealed the depth of her knowledge about her brother's habits and the growing desperation she felt as each day passed without results. She described Julian's methodical approach to route planning, his conservative risk management philosophy, and his unwavering commitment to communication protocols. Each detail reinforced the mystery of his disappearance, while highlighting the fundamental inconsistencies between his established patterns and the circumstances of his vanishing. The search effort had grown to encompass nearly 40 square miles of wilderness, involving over 100 personnel and resources valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The commitment demonstrated the respect Julian commanded within the climbing community and the determination of rescue professionals to find answers even when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. Every reasonable location where an injured or stranded climber might be found had been thoroughly investigated, leaving searchers to contemplate increasingly unlikely scenarios. Weather forecasts predicted deteriorating conditions that would force suspension of aerial operations and make ground-based searching more dangerous and less effective. Snow was possible at higher elevations, and sustained winds would ground helicopters while making exposed climbing routes too hazardous for technical search teams. The approaching weather represented a deadline that added urgency to efforts already stretched thin by days of intensive operations. Standing in the command tent as reports filtered in from teams scattered across the vast wilderness, Laura felt the accumulated weight of hope deferred, and questions without answers settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Each negative report chipped away at the optimism that had sustained her through the initial days of searching, replacing it with a growing certainty that her brother's fate would remain unknown. The mountains that had given Julian so much joy and professional satisfaction now seemed to guard their secrets with implacable silence, offering no clues about what had become of the man who knew them better than almost anyone alive. The exhaustion that permeated the search command center on the 6th day was palpable, settling over the assembled personnel like a heavy fog that dulled reflexes and clouded judgment. Coffee cups accumulated on folding tables beside topographic maps marked with colored pencils, indicating areas searched, resources deployed, and leads investigated. The initial energy that had driven rescue teams through their first days of operations had given way to the grinding persistence that characterized extended search efforts, where hope wrestled with statistical reality and professional duty battled personal frustration. Sheriff's Deputy Rodriguez stood before a whiteboard covered with photographs, grid coordinates, and timeline annotations, his weathered hands gesturing toward areas of particular interest as he briefed the morning shift supervisors. Dark circles beneath his eyes testified to nights spent reviewing case files and coordinating with agencies throughout California's search and rescue network. His voice carried the hoarse quality of someone who had spent days shouting instructions over helicopter rotors and mountain winds, but his attention to detail remained sharp despite the accumulated fatigue. The morning briefing was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, whose presence would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the investigation. Ethan Green approached the command tent with the hesitant gait of someone unsure of his reception, but compelled by circumstances beyond his comfort zone. At 28 years old, Ethan possessed the lean build and sun-weathered complexion common among field researchers who spent their careers working in remote wilderness environments, but his nervous energy suggested someone more comfortable with plant specimens than human interactions. Ethan's appearance at the command post created a minor disturbance among personnel accustomed to dealing with well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful civilian tips that characterized high-profile missing person cases. His torn field clothes and mud-stained hiking boots indicated recent wilderness travel, but his academic credentials as a botanical researcher initially seemed irrelevant to the urgent business of finding Julian Carter. The duty officer who greeted Ethan displayed the polite skepticism typical of professionals who had learned to manage public enthusiasm while maintaining operational focus. The transformation in attention occurred when Ethan mentioned that he believed he had encountered Julian Carter on the day of his disappearance, but in a location that contradicted every assumption underlying the massive search effort. According to Ethan's account, he had been conducting field research in a remote drainage system nearly 25 miles northeast of Whitney Portal, when he encountered a man matching Julian's description, under circumstances that defied logical explanation. Ethan's botanical research focused on the distribution patterns of rare alpine plant species in previously unstudied ecological niches throughout the Sierra Nevada. His work required extended periods in remote wilderness areas where few humans ventured, collecting specimens and documenting environmental conditions that might explain unusual plant communities. The location where he claimed to have encountered Julian represented terrain that would require multiple days of difficult cross-country travel from any established trailhead, accessed through boulder fields, stream crossings, and technical scrambling that would challenge experienced mountaineers. The detailed account that Ethan provided to increasingly attentive investigators painted a picture that was simultaneously compelling and deeply troubling. According to his testimony, He had established a temporary research camp in a cirque basin surrounded by granite walls and accessible only through a narrow canyon choked with fallen boulders and debris from ancient rock slides. The isolation was complete, with no trails, no cell phone coverage, and no reason for recreational visitors to venture into terrain that offered little scenic reward for the significant effort required to reach it. Ethan described discovering Julian's presence through the metallic sounds of equipment being manipulated, noises that seemed impossibly out of place in the profound silence that characterized the remote basin. Following the sounds to their source, he found a man matching Julian's description, engaged in what appeared to be some form of technical equipment setup. But the gear was scattered across the granite slabs in patterns that suggested confusion or disorganization, rather than the methodical approach characteristic of experienced field researchers. The physical description that Ethan provided matched Julian Carter in general terms, but included details that contradicted the careful preparation and professional appearance typical of his wilderness expeditions. The man Ethan encountered wore clothing that seemed inappropriate for the season and terrain. A bright orange jacket that would have been suitable for hunting season but stood out dramatically against the granite and pine environment of the High Sierra. Julian was known for his earth-toned clothing selections that reflected both practical considerations and aesthetic preferences developed through years of wilderness photography. More troubling than the clothing inconsistencies was Ethan's description of Julian's behavior and mental state during their brief encounter. According to the botanical researcher, Julian appeared disoriented and confused, repeatedly checking GPS devices and consulting topographic maps with the frantic intensity of someone who had become completely lost. His movements lacked the fluid confidence that characterized experienced mountaineers, replaced by jerky, anxious gestures that suggested panic or exhaustion beyond normal expedition fatigue. Ethan's account included disturbing details about Julian's equipment distribution that contradicted everything known about his organizational methods and safety protocols. Expensive geological instruments were scattered across granite surfaces where they could be damaged by weather or impact. Climbing gear hung from improvised anchor points in configurations that served no apparent purpose. Water bottles and food supplies were arranged in patterns that suggested systematic organization, but followed no logic that Ethan could discern from his observations. The conversation that Ethan claimed to have had with Julian provided additional concerning details about the missing climber's mental state and intentions. According to the botanical researcher, Julian spoke repeatedly about searching for a specific geological formation that he described in terms that seemed to shift and change throughout their brief interaction. He mentioned rock samples that didn't match the granite formations typical of their location, and referenced coordinate systems that seemed inconsistent with standard mapping conventions used throughout the Sierra Nevada. Julian's physical appearance, as described by Ethan, suggested someone who had been in the wilderness longer than the single day indicated by the timeline of his disappearance. His clothing showed signs of wear and exposure beyond what would be expected from a routine day hike. His facial hair appeared several days beyond his normal grooming standards. Most disturbing, his eyes displayed the hollow, unfocused quality that experienced wilderness travelers associated with severe fatigue, dehydration, or altitude-related medical conditions. The geographic location where Ethan claimed to have encountered Julian presented logistical challenges that seemed to contradict the missing climber's established patterns of route selection and risk management. Reaching the remote cirque would require navigation skills, physical conditioning, and time commitments that went far beyond Julian's documented plans for a routine geological survey near Whitney Portal. The terrain demanded technical climbing abilities and wilderness survival skills, but offered no particular geological features that would justify such an expedition from a research perspective. Ethan's description of their parting included details that would prove crucial to later investigations, though their significance was not immediately apparent to the search coordinators evaluating his testimony. According to the botanical researcher, Julian became increasingly agitated as their conversation progressed, repeatedly checking his GPS devices and expressing confusion about his location, relative to landmarks that should have been familiar to someone of his experience. He gathered his scattered equipment with movements that suggested panic rather than the methodical approach characteristic of his normal operations. The final image that Ethan provided showed Julian departing the cirque basin in a direction that would take him deeper into the wilderness rather than toward any established exit route or trailhead. His movement appeared purposeful, but was oriented toward terrain that would become increasingly difficult and dangerous as elevation and technical difficulty increased. Ethan watched him disappear around a granite buttress, concerned about his obvious disorientation, but uncertain about appropriate intervention given the remote location and his own limited wilderness rescue capabilities. The initial reception of Ethan's testimony by search coordinators reflected the skepticism that experienced rescue professionals maintained toward civilian reports that contradicted established evidence and operational assumptions. The location he described was so far from the primary search area that investigating his claims would require significant resource reallocation and fundamental revision of search strategies that had been developed through careful analysis of Julian's documented preferences and capabilities. Deputy Rodriguez and his team subjected Ethan's account to detailed questioning designed to identify inconsistencies, false memories, or attention-seeking motivations that might explain testimony that seemed to contradict physical evidence and logical assumptions about Julian's likely behavior. The botanical researcher's academic credentials and professional demeanor suggested reliability, but his claims required acceptance of scenarios that challenged everything the search team believed about the case. The skepticism intensified when investigators considered the timeline and logistics involved in Ethan's claimed encounter. For Julian to have reached the remote location described by the botanical researcher, he would have needed to begin his expedition well before the day of his documented disappearance, or travel at a pace and through terrain that exceeded reasonable expectations for a solo hiker carrying geological equipment. Neither explanation seemed consistent with Julian's established patterns or the evidence found in his truck at Whitney Portal. Professional rescue personnel had encountered numerous false reports, mistaken identities, and attention-seeking claims during high-profile search operations throughout their careers. Well-meaning civilians often reported sightings of missing persons that reflected psychological need for involvement rather than accurate observation. The remote location and unusual circumstances described by Ethan fit patterns typical of false reports that diverted valuable resources from productive search activities. The decision to dismiss Ethan's testimony reflected standard protocols for managing civilian input during extended search operations. Without corroborating evidence or logical explanations for the contradictions his account created, investigators concluded that his claims represented mistaken identity or fabrication, rather than legitimate intelligence about Julian's whereabouts. The botanical researcher was thanked for his civic concern but advised that his information did not warrant modification of established search priorities. Ethan departed the command post with obvious frustration and disappointment, his body language reflecting someone who felt dismissed and disbelieved despite sincere efforts to provide helpful information. His academic training had taught him the value of careful observation and detailed documentation, making the rejection of his testimony particularly difficult to accept. As a field researcher accustomed to working alone in remote environments, he understood the importance of accurate location reporting and the potential consequences of misinformation during emergency operations. The aftermath of Ethan's visit created subtle tensions within the search command structure, as personnel debated the wisdom of completely dismissing testimony that, while problematic, came from a credible source with relevant field experience. Some team members argued that the remote location should be investigated despite logistical challenges, while others maintained that resource limitations demanded focus on more probable scenarios based on established evidence and behavioral analysis. Laura Kincaid's reaction to news of Ethan's testimony represented the desperate hope of a family member willing to grasp any possibility that might lead to her brother's recovery. Unlike the professional skepticism displayed by search coordinators, her emotional investment made her receptive to information that others dismissed as implausible or irrelevant. She began developing her own theories about how Julian might have reached the remote location described by the botanical researcher, scenarios that required accepting explanations that challenged conventional understanding of the case. The botanical researcher's departure marked a turning point in the search operation where official skepticism began competing with nagging doubts about the completeness of their understanding. Ethan's detailed description contained elements that seemed too specific and technical to represent simple fabrication, while his professional credentials suggested someone capable of accurate observation and reporting. The geographic precision of his location descriptions and the technical accuracy of his equipment observations argued against dismissal as attention-seeking fantasy. As evening approached and search teams returned from another day of negative results in the primary search area, the shadow cast by Ethan Green's testimony grew longer despite official dismissal of his claims. The botanical researcher's account offered the only potential lead developed since Julian's disappearance, Yet accepting its validity would require fundamental revision of assumptions that had guided 6 days of intensive search efforts. The tension between hope and professional judgment created an undercurrent of doubt that would influence subsequent decisions as the search entered its most challenging phase. The weight of professional dismissal settled over Laura Kincaid's shoulders like a lead blanket as she sat in her rented motel room in Lone Pine, staring at topographic maps spread across the faded floral bedspread. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast unforgiving shadows across the detailed contour lines that represented thousands of square miles of Sierra Nevada wilderness, each elevation marker and drainage system a potential piece of the puzzle that had consumed her life for the past week. The official search operation continued its methodical coverage of terrain near Whitney Portal. But Laura's scientific mind refused to accept the categorical dismissal of Ethan Green's testimony. Her fingers traced the route from Whitney Portal to the remote Cirque Basin, where Ethan claimed to have encountered Julian. The distance appearing deceptively manageable on paper, but representing a journey through some of the most challenging terrain in the lower 48 states. The elevation profiles showed a roller coaster of ascents and descents through boulder fields, across exposed granite slabs, and around alpine lakes that had never appeared in any of Julian's documented expedition reports. The logistics seemed impossible, yet something in Ethan's detailed account resonated with Laura's intimate knowledge of her brother's capabilities and motivations. Sleep had become elusive since Julian's disappearance, replaced by restless periods of analysis and planning that stretched through the early morning hours. Laura's background in field biology provided her with wilderness skills that exceeded those of most search volunteers, and her familiarity with Julian's research interests gave her unique insights into locations that might have attracted his scientific attention. The combination of professional competence and desperate motivation began crystallizing into a plan that would take her far beyond the boundaries of official search efforts. The decision to investigate Ethan's claims independently evolved gradually through the dark hours before dawn, as Laura weighed the risks of solo wilderness travel against the possibility that her brother might be somewhere beyond the reach of conventional search methods. Her scientific training emphasized the importance of testing hypotheses rather than dismissing them without investigation, and Ethan's testimony represented the only significant new data that had emerged since Julian's disappearance. The official search operation's rejection of potentially crucial information violated every principle of thorough scientific inquiry that had shaped Laura's professional approach to problem-solving. Laura's preparation for her unauthorized expedition reflected years of experience conducting biological research in remote wilderness environments where self-sufficiency could mean the difference between successful data collection and dangerous emergency situations. She assembled equipment with the methodical precision that characterized her professional work, selecting gear that would allow her to reach Ethan's described location while maintaining the safety margins necessary for solo travel in unforgiving terrain. Every item was evaluated for weight, functionality, and redundancy, creating a load that balanced mobility against survival capability. Her backpack contained specialized equipment that reflected both her biological research background and her growing expertise in search and rescue operations accumulated during the past week. GPS units with extended battery life and backup power sources would ensure accurate navigation through terrain where traditional landmarks might prove insufficient for route finding. Emergency communication devices, including satellite messengers, would provide contact with rescue resources if her unauthorized expedition encountered difficulties that exceeded her solo capabilities. The pre-dawn departure from her motel room carried the weight of finality, as Laura understood that her decision to pursue an independent investigation represented a point of no return in her relationship with official search efforts. She left detailed notes explaining her intentions and planned route, ensuring that her own potential disappearance would not compound the mystery already consuming resources throughout the Sierra Nevada rescue community. The responsibility of solo wilderness travel in terrain that had already claimed one experienced mountaineer pressed against her consciousness like a physical burden. The drive from Lone Pine to the remote trailhead that would provide access to Ethan's described location required navigation through back roads and jeep tracks that appeared on few maps and showed no signs of regular maintenance. Laura's rental vehicle struggled with the rough terrain, its urban suspension system protesting against rocks and washouts that demanded the clearance and durability of specialized off-road equipment. The isolation increased with every mile, as cell phone coverage disappeared and the familiar landmarks of civilization gave way to endless expanses of granite and pine forest. The trailhead, if it could be called that, consisted of little more than a widening in the rough track where previous visitors had created informal parking areas among the scattered boulders and stunted trees. No signs marked the location, no trail registers documented visitor activity, and no maintained paths indicated established routes into the wilderness beyond. Laura's GPS units confirmed her position relative to Ethan's described destination, but the intervening terrain promised challenges that would test every aspect of her wilderness experience and physical conditioning. The initial hours of hiking followed faint traces of game trails and rock cairns left by previous travelers, but the route quickly deteriorated into cross-country navigation through terrain that demanded constant attention to route finding and hazard assessment. Boulder fields required careful movement to avoid twisted ankles or crushing injuries from unstable rocks. Stream crossings involved complex evaluations of water depth, current strength, and the consequences of equipment failure in frigid alpine conditions. Each mile covered represented a significant investment of time and energy that could not be recovered if circumstances required rapid retreat. Laura's scientific background proved invaluable, as she analyzed the terrain features and ecological indicators that might explain Julian's presence in such a remote location. The geological formations showed evidence of mineralization that could have attracted his research interest, while unusual plant communities suggested environmental conditions that might have warranted botanical investigation. Her growing understanding of the area's scientific value helped explain how Julian might have justified the significant effort required to reach such an isolated destination. The emotional weight of her solitary journey intensified as Laura progressed deeper into terrain that seemed to swallow human presence without trace. The profound silence, broken only by wind through pine needles and the distant sound of falling water, created an atmosphere that amplified every doubt about her decision to pursue this desperate investigation. Each step carried her further from assistance and deeper into wilderness that had already demonstrated its capacity to conceal secrets that professional search teams could not uncover. Navigation became increasingly challenging as the terrain steepened and traditional landmarks became obscured by the complex topography of granite walls and hidden valleys. Laura's GPS units provided precise coordinate information, but translating those coordinates into safe passage through cliff bands, loose scree slopes, and dense vegetation required constant micro-route adjustments that consumed mental energy and physical reserves. The gap between map representation and ground truth became a source of continuous stress as she questioned every route decision. The psychological pressure of solo travel in terrain where a single mistake could have catastrophic consequences grew heavier with each hour of solitary progress. Laura found herself talking aloud to combat the oppressive silence, her voice sounding strange and intrusive in the vast amphitheater of granite and sky. She reviewed emergency procedures and contingency plans with obsessive repetition, the mental rehearsal serving as both preparation and psychological comfort in an environment that offered no margin for error. Hours of difficult travel brought Laura to the general vicinity of Ethan's described location, but the final approach required detailed analysis of terrain features that might match his specific descriptions. The Cirque Basin he had mentioned could refer to several similar formations visible from her vantage point, each requiring additional time and energy to investigate thoroughly. The afternoon sun cast deep shadows that obscured details and created false impressions of distance and scale that complicated her navigation decisions. The discovery process began with systematic exploration of the most likely locations, as Laura applied scientific methodology to the problem of matching Ethan's testimony with actual terrain features. She photographed potential sites from multiple angles, recorded GPS coordinates for future reference, and made detailed notes about environmental conditions that might have influenced human activity in each location. The methodical approach helped manage her growing anxiety, while ensuring that crucial evidence would not be overlooked due to emotional pressure or fatigue. The breakthrough came in the form of subtle environmental clues that most searchers would have dismissed as natural phenomena. Scratches on granite surfaces showed patterns consistent with metal equipment being dragged or dropped. Compressed vegetation in sheltered areas suggested recent human presence, despite the absence of obvious footprints or trail markers. Small fragments of synthetic fabric caught on pine needles provided the first tangible evidence that someone had been in the area recently enough for such traces to survive weather exposure. Laura's heart rate accelerated as the accumulating evidence suggested that Ethan's testimony might have been accurate despite official skepticism. She expanded her search pattern to include areas that might have been visited by someone exhibiting the confused behavior that Ethan had described. looking for signs of equipment placement or camp establishment that reflected disorganization, rather than the methodical approach characteristic of experienced wilderness travelers. The critical discovery occurred during what Laura had planned as her final systematic search of the area, before admitting defeat and beginning the dangerous solo retreat to the trailhead. Tucked beneath a granite boulder in a location that would have provided shelter from weather and concealment from casual observation, she found a small electronic device partially buried under accumulated pine needles and debris from recent storms. Her hands trembled as she carefully extracted the object, recognizing the distinctive form factor of an older GPS unit that would have been state-of-the-art technology several years earlier. The GPS device showed obvious signs of impact damage and weather exposure, its plastic housing cracked and its display screen spider-webbed with fracture lines that rendered it completely unreadable. However, the internal components appeared intact, suggesting that data recovery might be possible despite the external damage. Laura's knowledge of electronic systems, gained through years of maintaining scientific instruments in harsh field conditions, gave her hope that the device might contain crucial information about Julian's activities in this remote location. The location of the GPS unit matched Ethan's description with uncanny precision, lying in the exact spot where he had claimed to observe Julian's scattered equipment and erratic behavior. The device's concealment beneath the boulder could have resulted from deliberate hiding, accidental loss, or natural processes that had buried it over time, but its presence provided the first tangible evidence supporting the botanical researcher's controversial testimony. Laura felt a surge of vindication mixed with dread as she realized that her brother had indeed been in this impossibly remote location. Further searching in the immediate area revealed additional evidence of human activity that had been invisible to casual observation, but became obvious once Laura knew where to focus her attention. Faint depressions in sandy soil between granite slabs suggested equipment placement or temporary camping. Disturbed pine needle litter showed patterns consistent with someone moving around the area for extended periods. Most significantly, she found fragments of geological sampling materials that matched equipment she had seen in Julian's home laboratory. The cumulative evidence painted a picture that was both encouraging and deeply troubling. Julian had definitely been in this remote location, vindicating Ethan's dismissed testimony and proving that the official search effort had been focused in completely wrong areas. However, the scattered nature of the evidence and the damaged condition of the GPS unit suggested circumstances that went beyond simple research activities or routine geological sampling. The disorganization that Ethan had described appeared to be confirmed by physical evidence of confused or panicked behavior. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Cirque Basin, Laura faced the sobering reality that her discovery, while significant, raised more questions than it answered. Julian's presence in this location contradicted everything known about his planned activities and established patterns of wilderness travel. The damaged GPS unit might contain crucial information about his route and intentions, but accessing that data would require technical expertise and laboratory facilities that were not available in the remote wilderness setting. The isolation that had seemed challenging during her approach now became a source of urgent anxiety, as Laura contemplated the solo journey back to civilization with evidence that could revolutionize the search effort. The GPS unit represented hope for finding Julian, but it also confirmed that he had been in terrain where survival prospects were minimal even for someone with his exceptional skills and experience. The weight of responsibility for this crucial discovery pressed against her chest like a physical burden as she prepared for the dangerous retreat through terrain that had already proven its capacity to claim experienced wilderness travelers. The fluorescent lights in the Inyo County Sheriff's Department evidence processing room hummed with an electrical persistence that matched Laura Kincaid's nervous energy, as she watched forensic technician Marcus Webb carefully extract the damaged GPS unit from its protective evidence bag. The device lay on the sterile metal examination table like an artifact from an archaeological dig, its cracked plastic housing and spiderweb display screen telling a story of impact and exposure that raised questions about the circumstances of its abandonment in the remote Sierra Nevada wilderness. Webb's movements reflected decades of experience recovering data from electronic devices that had survived everything from house fires to vehicle accidents to prolonged submersion in water. His specialized tools, arrayed with surgical precision on a clean white cloth, included microscopic screwdrivers, data recovery cables, and computer interfaces designed specifically for extracting information from damaged storage media. The process demanded patience and meticulous attention to detail, as a single mistake could destroy whatever information might remain in the device's memory banks. The initial examination revealed encouraging signs that data recovery might be possible despite the obvious physical damage. The GPS unit's internal components appeared intact, protected by the robust engineering that characterized professional-grade navigation equipment designed for harsh wilderness conditions. The memory storage chips showed no obvious signs of corrosion or physical destruction, suggesting that Julian's coordinate logs and route histories might have survived the trauma that had rendered the display screen useless. Laura positioned herself at the edge of the examination area, close enough to observe the process, but careful not to interfere with Webb's methodical work. Her scientific background helped her appreciate the technical complexity of data recovery operations, but her emotional investment in the outcome made it impossible to maintain the professional detachment that typically characterized her approach to complex problems. Each careful manipulation of the damaged device carried the weight of hope and desperation that had driven her through 7 days of increasingly desperate search efforts. Deputy Rodriguez observed the proceedings from across the room, his weathered features reflecting the skepticism that professional law enforcement personnel maintained toward evidence that seemed to contradict established investigative conclusions. The official search effort had invested thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars in systematic coverage of terrain near Whitney Portal, based on the logical assumption that Julian's truck represented the starting point for his final expedition. Laura's discovery of the GPS unit in a location nearly 30 miles from the primary search area challenged fundamental assumptions that had guided the entire operation. The data recovery process began with careful cleaning of the device's external connectors, removing accumulated dirt and moisture that could interfere with the delicate electronic interfaces required for information extraction. Webb used compressed air and specialized solvents to clear debris from connection ports that were barely larger than pencil leads, his movements guided by magnification equipment that revealed microscopic details invisible to naked eye observation. The precision required for successful data recovery demanded steady hands and extensive experience with the particular quirks of different GPS manufacturers and model variations. Connection of the damaged unit to Webb's specialized computer system required multiple attempts as he worked through various cable configurations and interface protocols that might successfully establish communication with the device's internal memory systems. The first several attempts yielded only error messages and connection failures, creating mounting tension in the small room where Laura's hopes rose and fell with each unsuccessful effort to access her brother's final recorded positions and route selections. The breakthrough came suddenly, announced by a series of electronic beeps from Webb's computer system that indicated successful establishment of communication protocols with the damaged GPS unit. Data began flowing from the device's memory banks to the computer's storage drives, streams of coordinate pairs, timestamps, and route information that represented Julian's final wilderness activities in precise numerical format. Laura felt her heartbeat accelerate as columns of GPS coordinates began populating the computer screen, each entry representing a specific location and time that might provide crucial insights into her brother's final expedition. Webb's computer system automatically began processing the raw GPS data, converting coordinate pairs into recognizable geographic references and plotting Julian's recorded movements on digital topographic maps. The first entries showed familiar patterns consistent with Julian's documented preferences for trailheads and approach routes in the Whitney Portal area. However, as the data processing continued, the plotted points began deviating dramatically from any logical extension of established hiking routes or geological research locations. The complete picture that emerged from the GPS data analysis shattered every assumption that had guided the week-long search effort. Julian's recorded movements showed a complex pattern of travel that began at Whitney Portal, but immediately diverged from all established trails and known destinations. His route led through terrain that appeared to serve no logical research purpose, crossing drainage systems and elevation contours that would have presented significant challenges without corresponding scientific or recreational rewards. Laura studied the digital maps with growing amazement and horror as the GPS data revealed the true scope of Julian's final expedition. His recorded coordinates showed travel through areas that would have required technical climbing skills, extended wilderness survival capabilities, and navigation expertise that went far beyond the requirements of routine geological fieldwork. The route complexity suggested either carefully planned exploration of previously unvisited terrain or increasingly desperate attempts to reach an objective that proved more elusive than originally anticipated. The timestamps associated with each GPS coordinate revealed another disturbing pattern that contradicted the established timeline of Julian's disappearance. According to the device's internal clock, his recorded movements began several days before the date, when he was officially reported missing, suggesting that his final expedition had been planned and executed in secret without notification to family members or documentation in his usual detailed trip reports. The implications were troubling, as they suggested either deliberate deception about his intentions or mental state changes that had influenced his normally transparent approach to wilderness activities. Webb's analysis software automatically calculated statistics about Julian's travel patterns that painted an increasingly concerning picture of his final expedition's progression. His average daily mileage significantly exceeded sustainable rates for wilderness travel through difficult terrain while carrying geological equipment. His elevation gains and losses suggested route selections that prioritized direct travel toward specific objectives rather than the energy-efficient approaches that characterized his established wilderness practices. Most disturbing, his movement patterns showed increasing randomness and backtracking that suggested navigation difficulties or changing objectives during the expedition's progression. The GPS data revealed Julian's presence in areas that had never appeared on any of his documented research proposals, grant applications, or informal discussions with family and colleagues about his scientific interests. The coordinates led through terrain that offered no obvious geological features worthy of investigation, crossed ecological zones that fell outside his documented areas of expertise, and accessed locations that would have required equipment and preparation beyond anything found in his truck or home laboratory. Rodriguez's skepticism began transforming into professional concern as the implications of the GPS data became clear. The official search effort had been focused in completely wrong areas, operating under assumptions about Julian's intentions and capabilities that proved fundamentally incorrect. Hundreds of volunteer hours and significant resource investments had been directed toward terrain that Julian had apparently never visited, while his actual route remained unexplored by any search teams throughout the week-long operation. The final coordinates in Julian's GPS log led to an area of the Sierra Nevada that Webb's mapping software initially failed to display properly due to incomplete topographic data coverage. The location appeared to fall within a complex of abandoned mining claims dating from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when prospectors had established temporary operations throughout the region in search of gold and other valuable minerals. The historical mining activity had left a legacy of tunnels, shafts, and abandoned infrastructure that created significant hazards for modern wilderness travelers unfamiliar with industrial archaeology. Laura's knowledge of Sierra Nevada geology helped her understand the potential attraction that historical mining sites might have held for Julian's research interests. The extraction operations had exposed rock formations and mineral deposits that would normally remain buried beneath surface materials, creating opportunities for geological investigation that might not be available elsewhere in the region. However, the remote locations and hazardous conditions associated with abandoned mining infrastructure made such sites unsuitable for solo research activities by anyone lacking specialized training in underground safety procedures. The mapping software's historical overlay function revealed the extent of mining activity in the area where Julian's GPS trail terminated. Dozens of abandoned shafts, collapsed tunnels, and debris piles scattered across several square miles of mountainous terrain that had been extensively modified by industrial extraction operations. The complexity of underground workings represented navigation challenges that could easily disorient experienced wilderness travelers, while structural instabilities created by decades of abandonment posed significant risks of collapse or entrapment. Webb's analysis of the GPS data timeline showed that Julian's final recorded position had been logged during daylight hours on the day of his disappearance, several hours before the time when he would normally have begun his return journey to Whitney Portal. The final entry was followed by no additional data, suggesting that the GPS unit had been damaged, abandoned, or had exhausted its battery power at that specific location. The abrupt termination of the coordinate log created an ominous endpoint to Julian's documented movements. The evidence processing room fell silent as the full implications of the GPS data analysis became clear to all present. Julian Carter had not disappeared while engaged in routine geological fieldwork near Whitney Portal, as everyone had assumed. Instead, he had undertaken a complex solo expedition to remote mining claims that had never been mentioned in his research plans or family communications. His route had taken him through terrain that would have challenged his considerable wilderness skills, while providing no obvious scientific justification for the risks involved. Rodriguez immediately began planning revision of search efforts to focus on the area revealed by Julian's GPS coordinates. But the logistics were daunting. The remote mining district lay beyond the reach of vehicle access, requiring helicopter insertion of search teams or extended approach marches through difficult terrain. The underground hazards associated with abandoned mining operations would require specialized rescue personnel with confined space training and technical equipment not readily available through normal search and rescue channels. Laura stared at the computer screen displaying her brother's final recorded coordinates, the precise numerical values representing both hope and dread in equal measure. The GPS data had answered the fundamental question of where Julian had gone during his final expedition, but it had also revealed circumstances that made survival increasingly unlikely. The combination of remote location, hazardous terrain, and underground infrastructure created search challenges that would test the limits of available rescue resources and capabilities. The damaged GPS unit had yielded its secrets reluctantly, but the information it contained would revolutionize understanding of Julian Carter's disappearance. His carefully planned deception about his true intentions, his dangerous route through unmapped terrain, and his apparent fascination with abandoned mining claims painted a picture of someone driven by motivations that remained mysterious even as his fate became increasingly clear. The coordinate journal had provided answers that raised even more troubling questions about the final expedition of one of the Sierra Nevada's most experienced and respected mountaineers. The pre-dawn darkness at the new staging area carried a different quality than the familiar command post at Whitney Portal, heavy with the metallic scent of abandoned industrial operations and the peculiar silence that settled over landscapes scarred by human extraction activities. Portable floodlights illuminated rusted mining equipment and collapsed wooden structures that had been slowly reclaimed by pine forest and granite weathering over the past century. The rescue teams assembling in this remote location moved with the focused intensity of professionals who understood that they were finally operating with credible intelligence after a week of searching in completely wrong areas. Sheriff's Deputy Rodriguez stood before a collection of topographic maps and historical mining surveys spread across the tailgate of his command vehicle, the paper documents weighted down against the mountain breeze by rocks and equipment clips. The maps revealed a complex underground network that had been excavated during the height of Sierra Nevada gold fever, when prospectors had followed ore veins deep into the granite bedrock through tunnels that twisted and branched like subterranean root systems. Many of these workings had been abandoned when the easily accessible deposits were exhausted, leaving behind a dangerous maze of unstable passages, hidden shafts, and structural collapses that posed significant hazards to modern search operations. The specialized rescue teams assembled for this phase of the operation represented resources that had never been deployed during the initial search efforts near Whitney Portal. Mine rescue specialists from California's Department of Industrial Relations brought equipment and expertise specifically designed for underground emergencies in confined spaces where traditional rescue techniques would prove inadequate or dangerous. Their breathing apparatus, communication systems, and structural assessment tools reflected decades of experience with the unique challenges presented by abandoned mining operations throughout the western United States. Technical Rescue Coordinator Sarah Martinez had spent the night reviewing engineering reports and historical documents related to the mining claims where Julian's GPS coordinates terminated. Her analysis revealed a sobering picture of underground workings that extended hundreds of feet into the mountainside, through multiple levels, and connecting passages that had been excavated without modern safety standards or structural engineering oversight. The original miners had followed ore veins wherever they led, creating a three-dimensional maze that could easily disorient experienced cavers and pose fatal hazards to anyone unfamiliar with underground navigation techniques. The approach march to the mining district required helicopter insertion due to the remote location and time constraints imposed by deteriorating weather forecasts. The aircraft arrived in waves, their rotors creating miniature dust storms as they settled onto makeshift landing zones, cleared from decades of accumulated debris and vegetation. Each helicopter carried specialized teams and equipment loads that reflected the unique demands of underground search operations, including portable ventilation systems, structural monitoring devices, and communication equipment capable of penetrating rock and earth barriers that would isolate rescue teams from surface support. Laura Kincaid occupied a position at the edge of the staging area, where she could observe preparations without interfering with the complex logistics of deploying specialized rescue resources. Her role as the family member who had provided the crucial evidence leading to this operation granted her access that would normally be denied to civilians. But the professional nature of underground rescue operations limited her involvement to observation and consultation about Julian's likely behavior patterns. The weight of responsibility for redirecting the entire search effort pressed against her consciousness as she watched teams prepare to enter environments where rescue could easily become recovery. The first reconnaissance teams entered the mining complex through the most stable and accessible tunnel entrances, their progress monitored through radio communications that provided continuous updates on conditions, hazards, and findings to surface coordinators. The underground environment proved even more challenging than historical documents had suggested. With structural deterioration that had accelerated during decades of abandonment and exposure to seasonal weather cycles that repeatedly froze and thawed water infiltration through fractured rock formations. Mine rescue specialist Tom Bradley led the primary search team into the main tunnel system, his decades of experience in similar environments evident in his methodical approach to hazard assessment and route selection. Each step required evaluation of floor stability, ceiling integrity, and air quality in passages where accumulated gases, structural collapses, and flooding could create life-threatening conditions without warning. His team's progress was measured in feet rather than miles, as underground search operations demanded attention to safety considerations that would have been unnecessary in surface wilderness environments. The tunnel systems revealed evidence of Julian's presence within the first hour of organized searching, dispelling any remaining doubts about the accuracy of the GPS data that had redirected rescue efforts to this remote location. Geological sampling equipment matching items found in Julian's home laboratory was discovered near tunnel entrances, along with disturbed sediments and tool marks that indicated recent human activity in passages that had remained undisturbed for decades. The evidence suggested that Julian had indeed been exploring these underground workings during his final expedition, confirming the most troubling implications of his coordinate logs. Bradley's team documented each piece of evidence with forensic precision, photographing equipment locations and recording GPS coordinates that would allow investigators to reconstruct Julian's underground activities with scientific accuracy. The distribution pattern of his geological tools suggested systematic exploration of multiple tunnel branches, indicating that his underground activities had extended over considerable time periods and covered significant distances within the complex mining network. The methodical nature of his equipment placement contradicted theories about accidental entry or brief investigation of the mining sites. Radio communications from the search teams created a steady stream of updates that painted an increasingly detailed picture of Julian's underground exploration activities. Additional tunnels showed signs of recent human passage, with disturbed dust patterns and moved debris indicating travel through passages that would have required technical skills and specialized equipment to navigate safely. The evidence suggested that Julian had possessed detailed knowledge of the mining complex's layout, implying research and preparation that had not been documented in any of his known activities or communications. The discovery came during the late afternoon hours when natural light filtering through tunnel entrances was beginning to fade, and portable illumination systems became crucial for continued search operations. Bradley's team had been systematically exploring a branch tunnel that led deeper into the mountainside than any of the previously investigated passages, following equipment traces that suggested Julian's presence in areas where structural hazards had increased significantly due to the greater depth and geological instability. The narrow beam of Bradley's headlamp first illuminated fabric that appeared distinctly out of place among the rust-stained mining equipment and natural rock formations that characterized the tunnel environment. Further investigation revealed Julian Carter's body positioned against the tunnel wall in a location that suggested he had been resting or seeking shelter when he was overcome by whatever circumstances had led to his death. His posture appeared peaceful rather than violent, showing no obvious signs of trauma or struggle that would indicate accidental injury or equipment failure. Bradley's initial assessment from a respectful distance revealed that Julian's death had not resulted from the mining-related accidents that rescue teams had been prepared to encounter during their underground search operations. There were no obvious crushing injuries from rockfalls, no signs of equipment entanglement or structural collapse, and no evidence of the traumatic injuries that typically characterized fatalities in abandoned mining environments. The absence of obvious accident indicators created immediate questions about the medical circumstances that had led to his death in such a remote location. The technical challenges of recovering Julian's body from the underground location required careful planning and specialized equipment that extended the operation well into the evening hours. Mine rescue protocols demanded thorough documentation of the scene before any disturbance of evidence, while medical examiner requirements added layers of complexity to recovery operations in an environment where standard forensic procedures were complicated by confined spaces and structural hazards. Medical examiner Dr. Patricia Hoffman arrived at the mining site as recovery operations were being planned, her presence ensuring that crucial forensic evidence would not be compromised by the necessarily complex process of removing human remains from underground locations. Her preliminary examination, conducted under the harsh illumination of portable floodlights in conditions far removed from standard autopsy facilities, revealed findings that would prove crucial to understanding Julian's final hours. The absence of traumatic injuries became more significant as Dr. Hoffman's examination proceeded with systematic thoroughness, despite the challenging environmental conditions. Julian's body showed no signs of impact trauma, crushing injuries, or other physical damage that would suggest accidental death in the hazardous mining environment. His equipment remained properly secured and functional, indicating that mechanical failure had not contributed to his death. Most significantly, his position and posture suggested that he had been conscious and mobile until shortly before his death, ruling out theories about gradual incapacitation due to exposure or dehydration. Dr. Hoffman's expertise in wilderness medicine helped her recognize subtle signs that pointed toward medical causes of death rather than environmental or accidental factors. Julian's facial expression appeared peaceful rather than agonized, suggesting that his death had been relatively sudden rather than the result of prolonged suffering or gradual system failure. His skin coloration and other observable indicators were consistent with cardiac events, rather than hypothermia, dehydration, or other exposure-related conditions that might have been expected in such a remote location. The preliminary findings were communicated to family members and search coordinators, while Julian's body was carefully extracted from the underground location, using techniques that preserved potential forensic evidence while ensuring the safety of rescue personnel working in hazardous conditions. Laura received the news of her brother's discovery with the complex mixture of relief and devastation that characterized the resolution of extended missing person cases, where hope had gradually transformed into acceptance of loss. The formal autopsy conducted in controlled laboratory conditions several days later revealed the shocking truth about Julian Carter's death that no one had anticipated, despite extensive speculation about potential causes. Dr. Hoffman's detailed examination identified a massive heart attack caused by a previously undiagnosed congenital cardiac condition that had remained asymptomatic throughout Julian's life until the fatal event in the underground tunnel. The medical findings indicated that Julian's death had been essentially instantaneous, occurring without warning while he was actively engaged in his geological exploration activities. The cardiac condition that killed Julian was identified as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a genetic disorder affecting the heart muscle that often remains undetected until triggered by physical exertion or stress conditions. The autopsy revealed significant structural abnormalities in Julian's heart that had somehow escaped detection during routine medical examinations throughout his life, despite his active lifestyle and the physical demands of his climbing activities. The condition explained why he had died suddenly and without apparent struggle in an environment where his wilderness skills should have ensured survival. The revelation that Julian had died from natural causes rather than accident, exposure, or equipment failure created a profound shift in understanding among family members, rescue personnel, and the climbing community that had followed the search operation with intense interest. The man who had survived countless challenging expeditions, who had built a reputation for exceptional wilderness skills and conservative risk management, had been claimed by an invisible enemy that no amount of preparation or experience could have detected or prevented. Laura's reaction to the autopsy findings reflected the complex emotions experienced by family members when long-sought answers proved to be fundamentally different from all anticipated scenarios. The relief of finally understanding what had happened to Julian was tempered by the realization that his death had been essentially random, unpreventable, and unrelated to any of the factors that had seemed most likely during the desperate week of searching. The genetic nature of his cardiac condition raised questions about inherited risks that had never been considered relevant to her family's medical history. The mining tunnels where Julian had died became a place of pilgrimage for family members and friends seeking closure in the aftermath of his unexpected death. The remote location and challenging access requirements limited visitors, but those who made the difficult journey found a strangely peaceful environment where Julian's final scientific curiosity had led him to discoveries that would never be shared. His geological samples, recovered along with his body, suggested that he had identified mineral formations of significant scientific interest during his underground explorations. The case of Julian Carter's disappearance and death became a sobering reminder of the limits of human preparation and the unpredictable nature of medical emergencies in wilderness environments. His story highlighted the importance of thorough investigation of missing person cases, the value of credible witness testimony even when it contradicts official assumptions, and the reality that sometimes the most experienced and well-prepared individuals can be claimed by circumstances completely beyond their control or anticipation. The memorial service for Julian Carter was held on a crisp October morning in the community center of Lone Pine, the building's modest walls unable to contain the overflow of mourners who had traveled from across the American West to pay their respects to a man whose life and death had touched the Sierra Nevada climbing community in profound and unexpected ways. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across faces weathered by high-altitude sun, and etched with the particular combination of grief and bewilderment that characterized those who had followed Julian's mysterious disappearance and shocking resolution. Laura Kincaid stood at the podium facing a sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces, each representing a different facet of her brother's complex life and the wide-reaching impact of his final expedition. Professional colleagues from universities across California sat beside rough-hewn climbing guides who had shared campfires with Julian in remote wilderness locations. Search and rescue volunteers who had spent days combing wrong areas of the Sierra Nevada occupied chairs next to family friends who had known Julian since childhood, but never fully understood the dangerous passion that ultimately claimed his life. The community center's walls displayed a carefully curated collection of Julian's photographs and geological specimens that told the story of a life dedicated to understanding the vertical world, where rock met sky in configurations that had fascinated him since adolescence. Images from expeditions to Alaska, the Andes, and the Himalayas revealed a progression of increasing technical skill and scientific sophistication, while mineral samples from Sierra Nevada research projects demonstrated the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his professional work. Each display case contained evidence of a man who had lived fully within his chosen element until that element could no longer protect him from the invisible enemy that had claimed his life. The assembled mourners represented a cross-section of the tight-knit mountaineering community, where Julian's reputation had grown through years of successful expeditions, published research, and generous mentoring of younger climbers seeking to combine adventure with scientific inquiry. Their presence testified to the respect he had commanded through consistent demonstration of the skills, judgment, and character that defined excellence in environments where mistakes often carried fatal consequences. The uniformity of their shock and confusion reflected the difficulty of accepting that someone of Julian's demonstrated competence could be claimed by circumstances that no amount of preparation or experience could have anticipated or prevented. Sheriff's Deputy Rodriguez occupied a seat near the front of the gathering, his presence representing not only official acknowledgement of the case's resolution, but also personal recognition of the search and rescue lessons that Julian's disappearance had provided to professionals throughout California's wilderness regions. His weathered features bore the subtle marks of someone who had learned difficult truths about the limitations of conventional search strategies and the importance of maintaining open minds when investigating cases that defied logical explanation. The week-long search operation had challenged assumptions and revealed gaps in understanding that would influence future missing person investigations throughout the Sierra Nevada region. The search and rescue community's response to Julian's case had been characterized by intense self-examination and procedural review, as professionals struggled to understand how such extensive efforts had been focused in completely wrong areas for so long. Training programs were being developed to address the possibility of missing persons who deliberately concealed their true intentions, or traveled to locations that contradicted their established patterns and preferences. Communication protocols were being refined to ensure that witness testimony like Ethan Green's would receive more thorough investigation before being dismissed as unreliable or irrelevant. Medical examiner Dr. Patricia Hoffman's attendance at the memorial represented the scientific community's recognition that Julian's death had contributed valuable information about the risks faced by wilderness athletes who might unknowingly carry genetic predispositions to sudden cardiac events. Her ongoing research into the intersection of extreme physical exertion and undiagnosed medical conditions had been profoundly influenced by Julian's case, leading to recommendations for cardiac screening programs that could potentially save lives among the climbing community where Julian had been so respected and admired. The geological specimens that Julian had collected during his final underground exploration occupied a place of honor at the front of the memorial display. Their mineral compositions and crystal structures representing the scientific curiosity that had drawn him into the abandoned mining tunnels where he had died. Preliminary analysis by university colleagues had revealed formations of significant scientific interest, suggesting that Julian's final expedition had yielded discoveries that would contribute to geological understanding of Sierra Nevada mineralization processes, even though their discoverer would never live to publish his findings or share his insights with the scientific community. Laura's reflection on her brother's final expedition had evolved through the weeks following the resolution of his disappearance, from desperate hope through crushing grief to a complex understanding of the man Julian had been and the choices that had shaped his final adventure. The secrecy surrounding his mining exploration suggested a side of Julian's character that family members had never fully recognized, revealing someone whose scientific curiosity had been powerful enough to override his normally transparent approach to wilderness activities and his established commitment to family communication during potentially dangerous expeditions. The botanical researcher, Ethan Green, occupied an inconspicuous position near the back of the gathering, his presence representing both vindication and the lingering discomfort of someone whose crucial testimony had been initially dismissed by authorities and search professionals. His accurate description of Julian's location and behavior had ultimately provided the key evidence that redirected search efforts and led to resolution of the case. But the weeks of official skepticism had left emotional scars that would influence his future interactions with law enforcement and rescue operations. His attendance at the memorial reflected both respect for Julian and personal need for closure, after being thrust unwillingly into the center of a high-profile investigation. The climbing community's response to Julian's death had been characterized by intense discussion about the hidden medical risks that might threaten even the most experienced and well-prepared wilderness athletes. Online forums and climbing magazines published detailed analyses of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and other genetic conditions that could remain undetected throughout years of successful mountaineering activities before manifesting fatally during routine expeditions. Medical screening recommendations and emergency response protocols were being revised to address the possibility that wilderness deaths might result from unpreventable medical events rather than the environmental hazards and human errors that typically characterized climbing accidents. The broader implications of Julian's case extended beyond the immediate climbing community to influence wilderness medicine research, search and rescue training programs, and legal frameworks governing missing person investigations. Universities were incorporating case study materials based on Julian's disappearance into curricula for emergency management and wilderness medicine programs, using the complex circumstances of his final expedition to illustrate the importance of thorough investigation and the dangers of premature closure when evidence contradicts established assumptions about missing person behavior and likely outcomes. The abandoned mining district where Julian had died became an unlikely pilgrimage site for family members, friends, and colleagues seeking to understand the final chapter of his life and the scientific discoveries that had motivated his secret expedition. The remote location and hazardous access requirements limited visitation. But those who made the difficult journey found a landscape that seemed to embody the intersection of human ambition and natural forces that had characterized Julian's entire career. The underground tunnels where he had died retained an aura of mystery and scientific possibility that helped explain why they had attracted someone of his curiosity and expertise. Laura's ongoing efforts to complete and publish Julian's geological research reflected her commitment to ensuring that his final discoveries would contribute to scientific understanding, despite the tragic circumstances of their collection. Working with university colleagues and former climbing partners, she had organized the scattered data and specimens from his final expedition into a coherent research project that would honor his memory while advancing knowledge of Sierra Nevada geological processes. The publication would represent Julian's final contribution to the scientific community that had provided the intellectual framework for his wilderness adventures. The psychological impact of Julian's case on search and rescue personnel extended beyond procedural changes to influence fundamental approaches to missing person investigations throughout California's wilderness regions. The experience of searching in wrong areas for days while the victim lay in a completely different location had created lasting awareness of the importance of maintaining broader perspectives and avoiding tunnel vision during high-pressure emergency operations. Training exercises now incorporated scenarios based on Julian's case to help rescue personnel recognize when conventional assumptions might be leading them away from rather than toward missing persons. The memorial service concluded with a moment of silence that seemed to encompass not only grief for Julian's death, but also recognition of the broader lessons that his disappearance had provided to everyone whose lives intersected with wilderness rescue, scientific research, or the pursuit of adventure in environments where human limitations often became starkly apparent. The silence stretched beyond the formal duration, as attendees contemplated their own mortality and the unpredictable nature of the forces that governed survival in the mountains that Julian had loved so deeply. As mourners filed out of the community center into the bright Sierra Nevada afternoon, their conversations reflected the complex legacy that Julian's story would leave within the climbing community and beyond. His death had demonstrated that even the most skilled and experienced wilderness travelers remained vulnerable to forces beyond their control, while his mysterious final expedition had revealed the importance of maintaining open minds and thorough investigation procedures when searching for missing persons in complex terrain. The combination of human tragedy and professional lessons would ensure that Julian Carter's name remained familiar to future generations of climbers, rescuers, and researchers who would study his case and learn from its unexpected revelations. The eastern Sierra Nevada peaks rose toward the cloudless sky beyond the community center windows, their granite faces reflecting afternoon sunlight that illuminated the same geological formations that had fascinated Julian throughout his career. The mountains remained unchanged by human tragedy, continuing their ancient processes of erosion and uplift that would outlast every individual who chose to explore their vertical realms. Yet somehow the peaks seemed to carry new meaning for those who had known Julian, and understood that his final expedition had taken him into underground spaces where the intersection of scientific curiosity and hidden medical vulnerability had created circumstances that no amount of preparation or expertise could have prevented. The story of Julian Carter's disappearance and death would become a cautionary tale that transcended its immediate tragic circumstances to provide lasting insights about the nature of wilderness risk, the limitations of human preparation, and the importance of thorough investigation when conventional explanations failed to account for observed evidence. His legacy would influence search and rescue protocols, medical screening recommendations, and the broader understanding that sometimes truth lay hidden in the most unexpected locations, waiting for determined investigators willing to challenge assumptions and follow evidence wherever it might lead, regardless of how improbable the destination might initially appear. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.